Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning here in Indonesia. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this 13th thematic session of the 2022 Global Platform for Disaster Reduction on embedding risk in investment decisions. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to everyone joining us online from around the world. It might be late if you're joining from the Americas. Good evening over there, and good morning to the rest of you. My name is Niels Holm Nielsen. I am the Global Technical Lead for Disaster Risk Management at the World Bank Group. I'm also the head of the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. I have the pleasure of moderating this thematic session, which will explore some of the key obstacles to embedding climate and disaster risk reduction measures in public and private investment decisions, and maybe a few ideas on how to overcome some of those obstacles. While investments in disaster risk reduction make sense, current levels of investment have proven largely insufficient, and additionally both public and private investment decision processes rarely involve considerations of how an investment may be creating disaster risk. So this also means that many costs of disasters remain either external to or maybe undisclosed in private and financial sector investment decision making. And the continued reliance on short-term time horizons for some financial decisions also remains a contributor to increasing disaster risk. At present, I think it's reasonable to say that most or much policy and regulatory environments and accounting practices do not consider disaster risk. And this means that investors rarely consider disaster risk in their decision making. So there may be a need to both better enable and maybe better regulate some parts of financial markets to better account for disaster risk. And this session will consider if and how to embed disaster risk in decision making. So with that, allow me to outline a few housekeeping matters to guide our session this morning. If you are watching online, and if you wish to follow the session in one of the 6 UN languages, you can select the language channel in the box to the right of the video window. It's very important that you mute the audio from the video player, otherwise you will hear the original language plus the interpretation. And there's a short video on the reception page that explains how to do this if you have IT trouble. For comments and questions to our panel members, please use the Slido application, and we will have a Q&A towards the end of the session where we will try to address some of these questions. In-room participants, all of you here, can connect on slido.com, that's slido.com, using your mobile phones and insert the code that's shown on the room screen. Behind me, maybe. For those following us online in Hopin, please access the tab Polls and Q&A. On the right-hand side menu, please indicate your name, organization, and country when doing so. And if you are in the room and unable to use the Slido, please raise your hand, and one of the in-room support staff will assist you. If you're in Hopin and are unable to use the Polls and Q&A tab or any other Hopin features, please contact the online support team via the chat box. So to kick off today's session, I would like to ask your opinion, you are online and you in the room, on an important question, and you can add your vote in the Polls and Q&A tab on the Slido app. And the question is, what is, in your view, the top barrier to ensure that investments are risk-informed? Regulatory and policy, use of risk information, or short-term thinking? And while you are hopefully voting to give us some of your insights and feedback, I will briefly introduce our distinguished panel here. We have with us online Ms. Tita Maya, Director General of the Department for Development Policy, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. And here next to me at the podium, we have Mr. Carlos Picado Rojas, Director for Strategic Development Unit, National Commission for Risk Prevention and Emergencies in Costa Rica. And we have to my left, Ms. Elena Panova, Resident Coordinator for the UN in Egypt. And to my right, we have Ms. Nadine Brown, Director, Sustainable Development Planning Institute of Jamaica. So now is when I was hoping to see the result of the poll. If you haven't had a chance to yet vote on which one of the three you believe is the most important barrier, please do so now. We will proceed to the panel while I'm waiting for the result of the poll, and I will try to get back to that and get a reaction from one of our panelists in a little bit to the poll result. But without further ado, let's hear from our distinguished panelists. So, what are key obstacles to embedding climate and disaster risk reduction measures in public and private investments, and how can they be overcome? Carlos, do you have a view on this?
Bien, gracias por la pregunta. En realidad es una pregunta bastante abierta y no le queda a uno más que hacer referencia a la experiencia que como país se ha tenido alrededor de esto. El enfoque preciso, hoy justamente lo conversaba con una amiga, alrededor del tema de cómo se interpretan los riesgos en un contexto como el nuestro y cómo en algunas ocasiones el concepto del riesgo sobre el cual tenemos que trabajar se interpreta en función de percepciones y no en función del conocimiento científico. Por ejemplo, para el Foro Económico Mundial es muy dado que se pase una encuesta entre grandes empresarios transnacionales para determinar cuáles son los riesgos que se perciben y podemos observar ciertas tendencias. En este momento, por ejemplo, la tendencia más inmediata es que los fenómenos del clima son los principales factores de riesgo. Y recientemente con el tema de la pandemia, de un pronto a otro, los fenómenos de orden biológico resultan ser los que ascienden también en importancia, más los cibernéticos. Y en un contexto, por ejemplo, el país en que yo vivo, un evento sísmico es el que podría potenciar los mayores daños en términos de pérdidas a la economía. Entonces, a veces hay que combinar la percepción que se tiene sobre un problema de riesgo con información real, información científica. Lo que sucede es que cuando entonces se le pide al científico que brinde información para poder orientar la inversión y la toma de decisiones sobre el desarrollo, el científico llega con datos que al tomador de decisión, las decisiones políticas no le sirven. El ejemplo claro en nuestro país es el de hace algunos años que se viene anunciando la posibilidad de un sismo de cierta importancia para el país. Y el científico nos habla del potencial en términos de liberación de energía, en términos de la cobertura que podría verse afectada, pero no habla sobre otras cosas. Y recuerdo que cuando en la administración particular en que esa información se dio, hubo una reunión con el presidente de la República para decirle de que había un pronóstico sísmico con cierta intensidad y la pregunta de nuestro presidente al científico fue ¿cuándo va a ocurrir? El científico le dice, bueno, la proyección es de aquí a 6 años. Y entonces el presidente, es que eso fueron cosas digamos muy del momento que lo recordamos, dijo, bueno, qué dicha, no me toca a mí. Entonces era evidente que en la proyección de la inmediatez de la administración A él le interesaba saber cuándo le iba a corresponder a él atenderlo, pero no tenía mayor información de las implicaciones que eso tenía. Lo que quiero decir es que el dato científico tiene que traducirse, el dato científico del potencial sísmico en este caso, tiene que convertirse también en datos sobre el potencial de daño que tiene para la economía y evidentemente para las acciones que va a generar en el desarrollo. Y esto es tan pertinente en el ámbito de la toma de decisiones del sector público como en el ámbito de las decisiones de orden privado sobre la inversión. Quiero comentarles que al final ocurrió el sismo, nada más como anécdota, ocurrió un sismo justo donde él lo había proyectado, se dio el potencial de daño y resulta que se dio el daño como tal y la magnitud del daño no fue tanto, aun y cuando el sismo sí tuvo el potencial, la liberación de energía que el científico había mencionado. Entonces, eso incide en la toma de decisiones porque no se le da entonces la atención adecuada cuando las cosas se materializan y no tenían las implicaciones tal y como habían ocurrido. Entonces, en la perspectiva de nuestro país, un país en vías de desarrollo que aspira a ser un país de renta media con ciertas condiciones de bienestar, lo relevante tiene que ver con cómo la información científica, el aporte que hacen los científicos se traslada a información pertinente para decisiones de otro tipo. Y ahí es donde yo veo un elemento intermedio que es el tema de la planificación. Cómo convertir la información científica que obtenemos y las proyecciones, las modelaciones con información que sirva para apoyar la toma de decisiones en los procesos de planificación. Creo que ya se terminó mi tiempo, entonces concluyo.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Nadine, I'll pose the same question to you. What are key obstacles to embedding climate and disaster risk reduction measures in public and private investments, and how can they be overcome?
Thank you, Niels. Good morning, everyone. I have identified 2 barriers which are aligned to some of the themes that was identified in a 2021 UNDRR report as it relates to barriers to risk-informed investments. One of the barriers I've identified is the quality, accessibility, awareness, and use of risk data and information. Issues related to data quality spans areas, coverage, and granularity. In Jamaica and the other Caribbean SIDS, some countries may possess the information required to support data-driven risk assessment and guide the investment decision-making process. However, the data may not be comprehensive, so you may have coverage for only sections of the country. So you have coverage for the coastal areas and not the interior, or vice versa. There's also the issue of the data being available, but only at a general level, not granular enough to support meaningful decision-making. In other cases, the data or information may be available, but not readily accessible to key stakeholders and decision makers. Where information is available and accessible, one may find that it is not being used. This may be due to a lack of awareness of its availability or limited capacity to use or interpret the data in such a way that it adds value to the decision-making process. In a recent knowledge, attitude, and practices study that was conducted for the pilot program for climate resilience in Jamaica, it was noted that 52.4% of public sector companies were more likely than private sector companies to report that climate change would greatly affect their sector. This is probably because the information is not communicated in a language that is understandable to the private sector, or that is decision useful, as one task force puts it. The other barrier that I've identified is that of oversight and governance, lack or limited policy, regulatory, and institutional framework. The existence of a policy and regulatory institutional framework to drive or guide the integration of risk in investment planning is critical. And how can these challenges be overcome? I'll share some of what we have been doing in Jamaica. We have tried to address some of our data quality challenges through how we have designed our strategic program for climate resilience, which has a strong component for improving climate data and information. So with the resources provided by the Climate Investment Funds, we have developed 3 State of the Jamaican Climate Reports, which spans the year 2012 to 2019, with downscaled scenarios and future projections for climate change impacts on key sectors up to the year 2100. And each of these reports is supported by a version that is tailor-made for policymakers with simpler and more direct messages about climate risk. There is also the development of the Jamaica Systemic Risk Assessment tool, which was launched earlier this month. And this is a decision support online application which supports decision-making and analysis of climate risk. On its full rollout, the JSRAT will enable evaluation and prioritization of policies and investment options to reduce losses and enhance infrastructure resilience. This was developed with support from the Coalition of Climate Resilience Investment and was launched earlier this month, as I said. To address data accessibility, we are in the final stages of developing a national risk information platform, which will allow users to visualize risk data and perform analysis on various elements of this risk data. The platform will also provide an opportunity for the re-engineering of business processes to include risk information into their decision-making process. To strengthen the policy and regulatory framework, we have embedded risk into investment planning successfully, and this begins at the national level. In Jamaica's case, we have integrated DRM as a key outcome of our long-term development plan, which is the Vision 2030 Jamaica National Development Plan. This set the context for the updating and development of other supporting policies, such as the Disaster Risk Management Act, the Climate Change Policy Framework, and the draft Comprehensive Disaster Risk Management Policy. We are also now in the process of preparing a disaster risk financing policy. We have supporting coordination mechanisms for DRM, and this includes the Disaster Risk Management Council with various subcommittees, and this council is chaired by the Prime Minister. We also have the Climate Change Advisory Board and the Climate Change Focal Point Network. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nadine. I think I picked up from both the comments from Carlos and from Nadine. Both seem to stress the importance of communicating risk. In the case of Carlos, he spoke a good deal about the importance of the scientific community, but translating their understanding and knowledge into actionable information. It's a miscommunication of the politician who is happy that the return period is 6 years and therefore it's not going to be his problem to handle. So there clearly is, in their views, a challenge around communicating risk. We heard from Nadine also the importance of data, several examples of what Jamaica has done to generate best standing and awareness, including communicating in a simpler and more direct language that enables policymakers to make decisions that are risk-informed. And also, we heard about timeframes, the 2030 focus, longer time perspectives that are important to factor in planning. So we will move forward. I think now is the moment when we can bring the results of our Slido in. I see it now. If I had my glasses, I would see it on the other screen too. All right, so that's interesting. It seems the room and the participants are almost evenly split across the three topics. I would like to turn now to Tita-Maija, participating from Finland, and ask you, Tita, do you have a reaction to this result? Is it surprising to you?
Well, thank you for giving me the floor. No surprises there. I think that these are issues that have been discussed thoroughly previously. But of course, there are, if you conclude these results together with the previous panelists, you can see that there are some issues that are in common. First of all, the obstacle to tackle that we need to tackle is the lack of data on climate risks, especially in developing countries. And without sufficient information, it is not possible to achieve risk-informed investments. This is certainly something that can be reflected on the results. Uh, of course, now if we look at especially the multilateral development banks, there is a double financing challenge in disaster risk reduction. Many client countries are reluctant to take loans for something that is unlikely to bring economic benefits in the short run. And donors then, in the other hand, are less inclined to allocate often some of these scarce resources to these purposes, and instead prioritize other purposes such as humanitarian action or grant-based assistance for the poorest and most fragile states. So there is something we need to do and look together. And I think that this is also clearly coming from the polls. In humanitarian assistance, so in responding to disasters, we speak of the need to widen the donor space. In the same vein, widening the resource base for disaster risk management is necessary. Public funds have been insufficient and are likely to remain so, and therefore private capital is of essence. And blended finance instruments are something that we all need to look upon in the future to give us some guidance. And this is something that you can also see in the polls. To overcome some of these barriers, we need to emphasize success and learn from previous experiences. And as you represent, Mr. Chair, the World Bank Group, the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, a global partnership managed by the bank, is a good example and acts as a financing and technical body to support disaster risk management across the World Bank Group. So there are some good examples that can actually answer to the issues that were brought up by the polls. I conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tida. I want to follow up with you, though. Do you have any sense, or you already alluded to several of this, but how different stakeholders could catalyze action, better align, with a focus maybe on better aligning public and private investment strategies, operations, and activities with the Sendai framework?
Well, Mr. Chair, I think that there are a couple of examples which can kind of like give us leadership. First of all, the coalition of finance ministers for climate action, co-chaired by Indonesia and Finland, bring together finance ministers of over 70 countries collaborating under the so-called Helsinki principles to promote national climate action through fiscal and economic policies. And as per Helsinki Principle 4, the coalition offers peer support and strivers to develop tools to address knowledge and expertise gaps in macroeconomic forecasting and fiscal planning for climate change impacts, as well as disaster risk management. Finland is also a member of the Adaptation Finance Champions Group that strives to address the barriers to increasing flows, quality, effectiveness, and accessibility of adaptation finance. And in April this year, Finland hosted the Lahti Adaptation Finance Ministerial, which then gathered ministers from around the world and senior representatives from relevant organizations to actually discuss the matter. And as an outcome of the ministerial, the Champions Group took upon itself the task to champion the development of a collective plan, then to deliver the agreement from COP26 to at least double climate adaptation finance from 2019 by 2025. And from the Sendai framework perspective, I would like to raise 2 points from the Lahti conclusions. First, the better understanding and management of climate risks is key for successful adaptation finance, especially in getting private finance on board in adaptation. And DRR, especially better meteorological services and early warning mechanisms, are a very cost-effective way to adapt to climate change. And as a concrete example of financing instrument, Finland can support its partner countries through the public sector investment facility. And this instrument is a mix of concessional credit and grant financing, which aims to catalyze public sector investments in developing countries. And of course, it is based on that country's own development needs. And at present, there is one ongoing project and several under planning to support investments in weather observation infrastructure and services with the state-of-the-art equipment of Vaisala Corporation and capacity building by the Finnish Meteorological Institute. These investments, of course, enhance both disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. I conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to pose the same question to you, Elena. How do you think different stakeholders can help catalyze action to better align public and private investment strategies, operations, and activities with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction?
Thank you very much, Niels. It's indeed a pleasure and honor to be on this panel today as a development expert. And allow me to continue where the previous speaker stopped. If we are serious about sustainable development, we have to make sure that the decisions around investments, the financial decisions, are risk-informed. Without this, there is no hope for sustainable development. And talking about sustainable development and also looking into the barriers that were listed on the prioritization of these barriers by the pool just now, the number one barrier is the short-term thinking. Therefore, the entire sustainable development and embedding the risks should be put in a much longer-term framework. So talking about, and I know many of you are development experts here in the room, we know that in most of the cases, we say that Agenda 2030 and Paris Agreement are the two sides of the same coin. However, I will argue here that we need to also bring Sendai framework as the third pillar for sustainable development. And we know that building resilience to shocks is fundamental if we are serious about achieving the sustainable development goals. And here I would like to also bring the principle of leaving no one behind. We need to uphold this principle. And climate action needs to go hand in hand with lifting the poor out of poverty, building their resilience, and also ensuring a dignified life for all. How do we do this? How do we make sure that the decision makers, the governments, the local communities, the regulators, the private sector, they take this into account? I think an effective approach, and I believe you would agree with me, will require cooperation, but meaningful cooperation, and contributions across the institutions and actors. One thing that needs to happen, and that's one of the biggest lessons learned after this crisis that hit us, is that we need to look into the systems, how we transform the systems so that these systems are fit to the crisis that we are facing. If we take, the first stakeholders, the governments, they're the regulators, they're the ones that set up the legal frameworks and catalyze action, and are in a position to catalyze action by requiring, for example, sustainability to be factored in the national budget, in the public procurement, in the various standards. And here I would like to bring the example with the government of Egypt. The first one that have come up with green bonds in MENA region, also very serious about greening the public procurement with very specific targets and reducing fossil fuel subsidies. So one example I would like to bring, very quickly, talking about silos. Most of the governments have national strategy, a DRR strategy, a climate change strategy, a national adaptation plan. The question is, are those working in silos? To what extent they are aligned, but they are aligned at the metrics level? This is when we become serious about overcoming the silos. So, and that, if we are serious again about building resilience, we need to really think and we need to make sure that it is embedded in the adaptation metrics, that those strategies talk to each other. So sectors like infrastructure, agriculture, all other sectors, they need to think not only for tomorrow, but also for long term, and that was clearly said in the poll. So I believe that going forward, that will require very close linkages between the science community, as Carlos was mentioning, having strong analysis, governments, private sector, and the local communities. And I will argue here, and with this I will conclude, that the United Nations has a role to play as a convener, as a neutral broker that can bring those actors together so that these silos are overcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena, for those comments. And thanks again, Tita, for your comments as well. It was fascinating to hear a bit more about what Finland has contributed in terms of tools for economic forecasting and facilitating the adaptation dialogue with ministries of finance. There's no doubt in my mind that adaptation as a core part of development therefore needs to be centered to the agenda of ministries of finance. But that doesn't mean it has been easy to bring some of the questions, and it relates to the issues around translating scientific knowledge into a language and an information basis that's relevant for that stakeholder group. We also heard from Elena, and thanks for reminding us of leaving no one behind and the important principles that includes. You mentioned resilience to shocks is key to achieving sustainable development. Absolutely. In fact, I believe my institution put out a report a few years ago in 2017, our World Development Report, that demonstrated that some countries have grown, are richer than others, not because they've grown faster, but because they've had fewer shocks. And I think that is a set of data points that backs up what Elena was mentioning. And thanks a lot for bringing in the excellent examples on what Egypt has achieved in terms of greening some of its public sector. So we'll now move forward to a third question, and I would like to address this first to you, Nadine. Would you have, from your practice, some successful examples on how we can bring the private sector on board to de-risk investments, and what are some incentives maybe that can be provided to interested private sectors?
Okay, the example I would like to share is that of the climate change adaptation line of credit. And this was a concessional financing mechanism that was provided under one of our PPCR projects, the Adaptation Program and Financing Mechanism project. This loan, which targeted MSMEs in the tourism and agriculture sectors because of the importance of these sectors to the Jamaican economy. These sectors are extremely vulnerable to climate change because of their direct or indirect dependence on natural resources and the location of infrastructure in high-risk areas, for example, in our coastal zones. Support is always therefore needed in these sectors to ensure business continuity. Under that particular facility, some 290 loans were disbursed to MSMEs to climate-proof their businesses. This initiative impacted over 1,700 households. And we learned a valuable lesson while we were implementing this loan. And it is that despite the fact that these loans were made available at a concessional rate, the willingness to borrow to adapt and build resilience to climate change, whether for smaller or larger businesses, requires significant effort in educating the marketplace about the link between climate change adaptation and the success of their businesses. The take-up of the line of credit by the MSMEs through a private sector intermediary was not initially as strong as we had anticipated, and therefore the PPCR partners had to step in and to come up with information and education campaigns to reach the target market that made the business case for adaptation. It was after this was done that we saw a more significant uptake of our climate smart loans. Another initiative in which the private sector has been brought on board, and this is a new initiative which was launched last year, is the Green Bond Project. This is a collaborative initiative between the Climate Change Division and the Jamaica Stock Exchange, and it's aimed at exploring the debt capital market as a source of financing for climate resilience and low carbon development in Jamaica. The project is designed to foster inclusivity and will bring together multiple stakeholders from the public and private sectors, as well as international stakeholders. Some of the non-fiscal incentives that we have identified to include the private sector or to reach the private sector, one of them is to just provide information, and information in the format that makes sense to the private sector. And I referred to this before. We want to provide information in a format that can be integrated into their financial models, their cost-benefit analysis, so that it makes a difference, so that the message gets across to them as how this will impact their bottom line. And then we need to possibly train the private sector in the use of this climate data and information to build their capacity to effectively use the tools and instruments that are available to them. We can support the preparation of business continuity plans, and this particular effort is being led in Jamaica by our Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management, and they have conducted a series of training exercises right across Jamaica for small and enterprises to equip them to prepare their business continuity plans. We can also include the private sector in the process from the program development stage of our major resilience building initiatives. And I think these are some of the ways that we can bring the private sector on board to de-risk investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadine. I'll pose the same question to you, Elena. Would you have, from your practice, some successful examples of how we can bring the private sector on board to risk investments, and what are some incentives that can be provided to interested private sector partners?
Thanks, Niels. If you allow me, I will start, with some of the barriers very quickly, we'll touch upon, because in Egypt, UNEP, the financing initiative, did a study to understand, what are the issues, why the private sector is not investing overall in climate, and more specifically in climate adaptation and resilience. So the study revealed that the main barriers to private investment in climate adaptation, specifically and resilience, is that these investments are perceived by private sector first as high risk and second as low return. This is the reality on the ground. So what needs to happen, and how do we need to strengthen the private sector in climate adaptation and resilience? And I believe you would agree with me, and that's a huge effort that needs to be done by all of us. This is to make adaptation projects more appealing to the private sector, and to make sure that they support resilience building, but on the other hand, they also bring investment returns. And in this regard, using innovative financing models such as blended finance or impact investment is very important. De-risking the project, addressing the issue, of high risk by de-risking them, bringing concessional finance. And the multilateral development banks here, including the World Bank, have a huge role to play by ensuring that these high-risk projects are actually de-risked, but at the same time, making sure that they are not building new depth. And I'm very pleased that today we speak about investments specifically, because this is what is needed. It's investment that is more needed rather than, taking loans. Because it seems that the next crisis coming, if not yet here, is the huge indebtedness of the developing countries. So blended finance can be targeted to investments that benefit both private and also public sectors. For example, if you take investments in climate-smart technology, agriculture, climate-resilient infrastructure, or better climate monitoring technology, all these create both public and also public and private benefits. So again, going back to Egypt, you know that Egypt is hosting the next COP, the COP27, and building towards COP27, there is the understanding that there should be incentives built for increased investments of the private sector. And that will be a very important theme at the COP27, because it will be a COP about implementation. So with this understanding of the need to unlock private finance to adaptation, the government of Egypt, together with partners and the multilateral development banks, is currently working on a guidance for countries specifically on blended finance, where it will be looked in depth what is the role of the various stakeholders and what can they bring to the table, what will make a project, what will de-risk the project, what will be the percentage of a concessional finance that will be needed, and what will be, for example, the role of the credit agencies, which have also a huge role. Another concrete example is about the Sdg Bonds. Very powerful, very important, and that's a scalable example. So and there are a number of governments that have already issued Sdg Bonds, and the government of Indonesia, by the way, being one of those, together with the government of Mexico, government of Uzbekistan, as far as I know. And I'm very proud that the United Nations, specifically UNDP and some of the other agencies, were closely working with the governments in putting the framework for the Sdg Bonds. And what is important here, again, if we are serious about resilience building, we need to make sure that resilience, that the resilience building is embedded in the framework of the Sdg Bonds. I was just attending the previous session that was on financing for resilience building, and clearly the outcome of the session was that the funding and the finance for climate resilience projects ultimately make the investments more effective, more secure, and more durable. But again, we need to be together in this, and we need to bring the expertise that all stakeholders have in order to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elena. I think the first point you were making on high risk and low returns for the private sector, it's very clearly an issue. If we can't collectively figure out how to overcome that one issue, then I think the whole notion of involving private capital and resilience financing is not going to go very far. So that's absolutely a key piece of the puzzle. You also mentioned blended finance potentially as part of the solution to that. Personally, I would agree with that notion as well. I do think there's a space also for MDBs, as you referred to play in terms of helping de-risking, not only through concessional finance or other blend finance mechanisms as part of the puzzle, but also probably in terms of enabling the project constructs themselves to be more viable from an operational and technical point of view, which takes a number of risks out of the equation for the potential private sector involvement. And Nadine, you shared with us a few quite different, very exciting examples, both about some of the innovation that Jamaica has been part of related to the green bond, but also the challenges and opportunities in trying to enable small scale, small and medium enterprises to think about preparedness and their own resilience in terms of potential climate shocks, and how important, again, I think you went back to the information basis, that the initial market response was low and public sector had to step in to generate information that enabled then a better market response. Thank you for that. I will now turn to Carlos again and ask a different question. What are some of the unique challenges among the least developed countries in embedding disaster risk in public and private investments, and how do you think these can be addressed? Carlos.
Sigue siendo preguntas difíciles de responder, porque el tema de las inversiones debidamente informadas pasa por una discusión, por una parte, en la responsabilidad que puedan tener los gobiernos en términos del proceso de planificación, y por otro lado las iniciativas privadas en términos de las orientaciones que el mercado le fija para obviamente generar ganancia. Entonces, uno de los aspectos que yo he apuntado a esta pregunta tiene que ver con justamente el tema del diálogo que tiene que haber entre los sectores productivos para la orientación del modelo de economía que se quiere plantear, en donde dentro de ese modelo evidentemente debería estar presente una clarificación muy específica de los riesgos sobre los cuales se enfrenta. Esto es interesante porque en el mundo, digamos, que nosotros nos movemos, el mundo de la gestión del riesgo de desastres, llegamos a limitar el concepto a un concepto de la posibilidad de que se materialice eso que llamamos desastre. Y en la lógica del mercado es curioso, pero los desastres son un riesgo más, no sé si me voy a entender. El desastre como un riesgo y no el desastre como la materialización del riesgo. Y esto presenta una limitación en cómo, desde la perspectiva de quienes estamos en organizaciones que estamos constantemente intentando identificar y promover un conocimiento adecuado del riesgo, lo vendemos a quienes son los actores de la actividad económica. Entonces, en el contexto de nuestros países, creo que porque me inscribo como representante de un país que está en vías de desarrollo, en términos de esa necesidad de variar un poco los esquemas y los modelos de interpretación de los problemas que tenemos. En el informe del GAR 2019 se hacía un planteamiento muy interesante alrededor de que los mayores compromisos en materia de reducción de riesgo estaban en manos de los gobiernos, de las autoridades de gobierno, y se notaba en el proceso de medición de los avances del cumplimiento antes del marco de Hyogo, luego el marco de Sendai, que los gobiernos habían asumido compromisos y que habían avances. Sin embargo, faltaba un actor clave y era justamente el sector productivo, señalando básicamente que es el sector productivo el que genera los riesgos. En ese sentido, si hay como una situación dispareja, los gobiernos comprometiéndose con metas orientadas a reducir el riesgo y el sector productivo con un enfoque de mercado orientado más bien a sacar provecho en la economía. Entonces, justamente en marco de Sendai planteó el concepto de la responsabilidad compartida para poder abordar de manera distinta esta integrar al sector productivo. Y como bien lo dijo Elena, hay una importancia fundamental en que los gobiernos bajo el marco normativo que tienen, puedan promover lo que yo llamo una doble línea. Por un lado, las regulaciones necesarias para orientar de manera casi que punitiva el enfoque de la actividad del sector productivo, pero por otro lado también, desde la perspectiva de la planificación, los incentivos y las motivaciones al sector productivo para que se oriente bajo una agenda no tanto de rentabilidad desde el punto de vista del negocio y de lo que quiero ganar, sino también una sustentabilidad que también contribuya a la orientación del desarrollo que tenemos. Creo que esto es bien importante porque, ya para terminar, en general cuando desde la agenda del sector productivo se plantea esto, se plantea bajo un concepto básicamente de continuidad de negocio y de no permitir que el desastre limite mi posibilidad de ganancia. En la perspectiva del sector público está mucho el concepto de la continuidad del servicio, pero debería estar orientado en un enfoque de que los desastres no limiten, no interrumpan los objetivos que se están buscando, los objetivos del desarrollo. Entonces, en resumen, lo que estoy queriendo plantear es que debe haber un diálogo y una convicción de las partes de que el proceso está en una noción de ganar y ganar en las dos partes. Gracias.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to unpack in that answer, but I'll paraphrase a little bit, and forgive me for obviously not capturing the wealth of what you were sharing, but among what you were saying, I think the key notion that maybe all development, economic development, requires risk-taking, but disaster risk and maybe climate risk is often
we spend about less than 1% of GDP related to the disaster. But if there is a disaster, it costs more than 10% of GDP. That's why we create about the pooling fund. Now the pooling fund is coming from the local budget, still from government, both of national and the local government. But we hope in the future, pooling fund, we can collect the fund from not only from the government, but about the private sector. So we can independence about that, how to finance about the disaster. Therefore, Indonesia offers knowledge of co-production on disaster risk reduction and climate change agreement, thinking in investment, particularly with the LDC and small island development state, as well as to encourage the development of systematic risk financing through creative financing or risk transfer schemes. I think this offer aim for the building sustainable investment to enhance sustainable resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing those important points and a bit about the wealth of experience that Indonesia has developed over the years. And of course, Indonesia, our host, you've had to learn how to live with disasters of all kinds of origins. And in that learning, of course, you have a lot to offer the world in terms of the knowledge and understanding, the regulatory and the financial tools that you have developed to become better at living with the risk. So thanks a lot. I'll take a question here from my screen that came online, and then we will go to the room afterwards. We can maybe take the gentle lady over there first, and then the gentleman, and then. But I'll take a question from here first. So one question that has come in is, and maybe I can ask Elena for your view on this. Subsequently, maybe Nadine. Green and climate bonds do not yet take resilience or not yet organized around resilience as a criteria. Can we make this happen? Elena, any views on this?
I agree, because the examples which we have, not that many, not many countries. If there are many countries with green bonds, but whoever asked the question is absolutely right, that not necessarily resilience is embedded in the green bonds. And going forward with the SDG bonds, there is an effort, but we are not yet there. So I think, again, we come back to working together and making the case, making sure that there is this understanding that the SDG bonds will help us leverage private financing when it comes to prevention, adaptation, and also mitigation actions. We need to make them also attractive. When I talk to the finance minister of Egypt, he understands the importance of issuing green bonds because that positions the country. But if you look into the financing benefits for the Ministry of Finance and the country, they are not there. They are not attractive. They come with the same interest rate like the other bonds that are much easier to issue and implement, because both SDG bonds, green bonds, they come with heavy reporting, but at the same time, and I'm sure Niels knows it better than me, they do not come with a lower interest rate. So I think a lot needs to be done so that they become attractive, and indeed the governments are not just doing this, because the investors expect and because it's positioning, but they see the real benefit of doing this. And back again to the metrics, it is important that we introduce disaster prevention as a criterion in the framework itself. This is where the development partners can come in. When you develop the framework for the SDG bonds or the green bonds, you make the case that disaster prevention should be featured there. And that will lead to projects, environmental or social projects, which embed disaster prevention. I don't know whether I answered, but I tried at least.
Very good. Thank you, Elena. Nadine, do you have a view on this, on the resilience bond question? Is that possible or even desirable?
Okay, I support Elena's response. As I said before, we have just embarked on this particular process. And so this is we have just launched the project. And so I maybe would not have a lot to say about if this is at all possible. But I support Elena's point about making the case that disaster should be included into the criteria where green bonds are concerned. We are doing this initiative with the Jamaica Stock Exchange, and I believe that it is a reachable target, something that we can explore and should explore. And I guess we will have more to say about this as we implement the project and roll it out over the next few years.
Thank you, Nadine. I guess, if I may paraphrase what you said, Elena, more work without an additional return is not a good business proposition. Yes. So there's still some work to be done. All right, I would like to turn to the room. We have a question over there.
Hello. Sorry. So just on the point that it's low return, high risk. So maybe the private sector financing is going to be a bit of a longer, more difficult avenue. So if adaptation investment is seen as more of a public sector thing, is a way around, is a way to increase adaptation investment in DRR? Is this a feasible solution to reduce the debt, sovereign debt payments, so reduce the rates, and then have that as a way to free up some financing for emerging countries to invest in DRR. I think the argument could be made that this would decrease the humanitarian assistance bill for donors, and equally could constitute the adaptation funding that the emerging countries are asking for. So I was just wanting to test if that would be viable, equally from your point of view, Niels.
Thank you. Let's take 2 more questions, and then we'll try to get the gentleman up here has been waiting patiently first. Then there's another gentleman a few rows down who's going to come in third. I've sort of seen your hands, but we'll get to a second round of questions. Thank you. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for this opportunity. I happen to be a member of the organizing team for this session. And I'd like to raise a question. Majority of the investments are made in the private sector. And I was wondering if any of the panelists have real examples of incentives for the private sector to invest a little bit more for disaster resilient, let's say, houses or other infrastructures or buildings or other private assets. In Japan, the Development Bank of Japan has a special low interest loans for large-scale companies to invest for disaster-resilient factories or warehouses. There are many local banks and local credit unions which provides low-interest loans for seismic retrofitting of houses or small shops, because they think that if their market prospers, they will have sustainable business. And I was wondering if other countries have such examples. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I will hold the panel off a little bit, but please take note, because I'm going to turn to one of you. The gentleman here in the middle by the aisle. Sorry, I'll get to you next. The lady up there.
Thank you very much. My name is Nadia Holland from the European Disability Forum. I was just wondering, there are a lot of gaps when it's about making disaster risk reduction inclusive for persons with disabilities. Does one of you have an example, for example, how the private sector can make, in the beginning, all the crisis communication, risk information, and critical infrastructure and services more accessible? So to take that so that it completes each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's take the 4th question as well, and then we'll go to a round of the panel here.
Hi, this is Ben Webster at the back. I work with the Risk-Informed Early Action Partnership, which is a coalition of governments, civil society, private sector, UN agencies. The question from my side is we've seen really good progress recently on using forecasting and risk analytics to respond ahead of the disasters that we've heard cause so much impact. I'm wondering, though, what it would take. So far it's been resourced by the humanitarian sector, but what would it take to adapt some of the other financing instruments, the development bank instruments, to become more anticipatory, to respond earlier? So adapting CAT DDOs, the crisis response window, so that we can actually mitigate and reduce the impact of the hazards. Thank you.
All right, so there was a question over here on, I think, around whether or not one could imagine a scheme of exchanging debt for DRR financing. Sorry to paraphrase, but that's how I understood the question. Did you raise your finger? You have a view on this? I'm wondering, Tita, if I can put you on the spot, if you have a view on this. Do you think it's? Do you think that kind of scheme is viable?
For the question, and of course, everything is viable, and it is of course of utmost importance to get the finance ministers of all the countries basically to sit on the same table, because this finally ends up at their desks. And I would say that the coalition of finance ministers is a right address to discussion issue like this. We've noticed along the years that when there is enough political will, everything is possible, but it of course requires quite a bit of work before we get any decisions. Let's put it that way. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Yes, absolutely, Elena.
Just one sentence. With regard to this question, I don't have the answer, but I know, and that I know that the finance ministers, especially finance ministers of Africa, are working on this, because this climate debt swaps is something which Africa would like to put forward, at the COP27. Because again, as we talked about the high indebtedness, there is this thinking of coming up with climate debt swaps. And we hope that something, I know that currently in Capo Verde, there is an attempt of this. There are countries, including Egypt, not specifically for climate, but for development swaps, debt swaps that are successfully implemented. Italian, German debt that were put, into development projects. So indeed, there is work going on, and we believe that that could be, one of the suggestions put on the table at the COP27.
Thank you very much, Elena. We had a question up here on about examples of incentives to enable private sector invest in DRR. Nadine, do you want to react to that maybe?
Okay, so we had a similar project in Jamaica that looked at incentives. Jamaica is often affected by periods of drought, and this affects our water supply and our distribution systems. And what was done under the project I mentioned earlier, our strategic program for climate resilience, was that we had, there was a private sector set aside as a part of the CIF framework, in which we included a major mortgage entity to issue low interest loans as incentives to developers to include the use of rainwater harvesting systems, water efficient fixtures, to develop more resilient housing in Jamaica where water, the use of water is concerned. We had some issues with that particular project, but there are aspects of that project that has been institutionalized now into that mortgaging entity. We have developed a water adaptation guide for architects, drainage engineers, and planners, and basically did a training program to teach these engineers, planners, etc., in the techniques of the installation of rainwater harvesting and grey water recycling systems for that same stakeholder group. As I said before, the project has ended, and we have institutionalized some of the activities under that project. Where the training is concerned, we're trying to perpetuate the whole thinking by signing MOUs with the University of Technology to keep the course running for the stakeholder groups, the architects, the engineers, etc. And this is also being done through our training agency as well. So that is the closest example I could find to what you shared.
Thank you, Nadine. Carlos, I'm wondering if I can direct the third question to you. I believe about 1 billion of the world's population live with at least one disability. So the question obviously have an enormous relevance. And do you have any examples or maybe ideas from your work in Costa Rica around how to improve or ensure hopefully both inclusiveness in disaster risk reduction interventions, in campaigns, in communication campaign, or in access.
Creo que lo que yo podría mencionar en términos de ejemplos de acceso a la información se repite mucho en algunos de los países de la región de la que yo vengo. En términos de que en general la información que surge de la investigación se coloca en sitios que son de carácter público, de uso público. Sin embargo, el inconveniente que hay con los centros de investigación que generan la información es que reconocen que hay un valor, un costo asociado a la investigación y, ¿por qué no decirlo?, al negocio de la investigación relacionado con el tema de riesgo. Entonces, en algunos casos, según sea la naturaleza de la información y para qué propósito se está pidiendo, las organizaciones de investigación pública demandan el pago del servicio de información. Entonces, estoy hablando, digamos, concretamente de la realidad que nosotros tenemos. De ahí que, por ejemplo, la institución que yo represento sí pone la información a disposición de cualquier persona, pero vuelvo a insistir, el inconveniente no está en el acceso porque ya lo había, en el acceso a la información tal y como la producen los centros científicos, sino en el acceso a la información tal y como la ocupo para tomar decisiones. Entonces, en realidad lo que yo tendría que señalar es que en este momento es cuando se está dando paso a que la información se traslade a elementos de modelación sobre riesgo en función del tipo de amenazas y en función de sectores productivos en particular. Por ahí es donde quería mencionarlo. Quería nada más muy brevemente referirme a la pregunta anterior que hizo alrededor del tema de la participación del sector privado y de lo que piden, ¿verdad? Yo les quería contar que hubo un ejercicio de diagnóstico que hicimos para ver qué reconocían el sector privado como elementos de incentivo para ellos promover y desarrollar prácticas de gestión de riesgo. A nosotros nos sorprendió la respuesta, porque lo que demandaron de parte del sector público es básicamente agilidad de tramitación en los permisos que tienen para desarrollar producción. Nos llamó la atención eso porque decían que estaban dispuestos a adoptar prácticas de gestión de riesgo en la medida en que las regulaciones, por ejemplo, de carácter ambiental que aplica el gobierno, se reducían no tanto en la rigurosidad, sino en los tiempos de cumplimiento del trámite. Igualmente, en nuestro país hay una serie de normas que obligan a las empresas privadas a tener programas de responsabilidad social. Entonces, uno de los aspectos que hemos tratado de promover es que esos programas de responsabilidad social, bajo un concepto de sustentabilidad corporativa, se orienten en términos de la cadena de valor de producción, digamos, de las empresas y que, por ejemplo, la actividad de responsabilidad social no se oriente como una acción altruista de apoyo a una comunidad que tiene problemas de pobreza y demás, sino más bien que la responsabilidad ambiental, la responsabilidad social tenga un carácter más ambiental y orientado a resolver los problemas de generación, de contaminación y de riesgo que genera la misma actividad productiva. Entonces, es como la doble vía, digamos, de acción, de lo que pide el sector privado y lo que el Estado quiere que también haga el sector productivo.
Gracias, Carlos. We had another question I would like maybe to pass on to Chita. It was related to, I think, how to finance forecasting and risk analytics that's required and needed for any anticipatory action in this space. Do you have any views on this, either from your bilateral point of view or possibly your involvement in the bigger space of financing?
Sure. Well, I think that, like several financing institutions, like the one you represent, already have good examples on how to do this. Of course, we work very closely together with the World Meteorological Organization, and we also have blended finance instruments that would kind of like meet the same goals or at least contribute towards the same goal. I think what is extremely challenging, what like both Nadine and then UNDP have brought up, is to find so-called bankable projects where the private sector really takes an interest. And I think that like we need to have sort of incentives in terms of blended finance to actually attract enough interest. And we, for instance, have now channeled about 1 billion euros through the blended finance instrument nationally. And some of these examples are really in the Caribbean, for instance, where we have invested heavily on early warning systems, on satellites, etc., that will be part of a solution. But they are not part of the solution alone. I would first of all want to thank the person who was just stating important issues about inclusivity and about disability. It is, of course, of utmost importance that we get the private sector interested. But I think that it will be with the grant funds that we will need to take care of the inclusivity agenda. And we need to be very vocal in different organizations that we get the disability and inclusiveness agenda high on top of all the bankable projects as well. Because if we want them to be successful, they also need to be inclusive. Thank you.
Thank you, Tita. So we are running short on time, unfortunately, but it's great that you've been so engaged and with all these questions. I do want to offer the gentleman who has patiently been waiting for a while to ask his question. If you have one, then we'll do a last question and then a brief answer, and then we will be wrapping up. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I'm Shumon Hassanul Islam, coming from Bangladesh, one of the most climate and disaster affected country. And I'm talking from the perspective of SMEs, particularly in the finance, disaster resilience finance. Well, from the very top level strategic policy decision to planning and everywhere, big investment by the private and government sectors is well articulated, though in practice or taking them to the user level on the ground is most difficult part of the work, I understand, from the countries like Bangladesh who are developing. Because ultimately for the SMEs, it is the ground level bank manager and the SME user who are most generally, they are not that formalized investment they have or the documents they need. So it is important, and they're not much aware about all this discussion and theoretical and planning process of climate and disaster management. So from that perspective, I'm just sharing my experience. This educating of the user and the implementation level people is most important when we think about the SMEs, who are the most affected and vulnerable for the disaster things. Yes, big corporates and governments investment are at risk, but the most vulnerable are the SMEs, small and medium enterprise particularly. So from my experience and also hearing from Nadi, I'm interested to more about how you experience and overcome those particular problems in your country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Nadine, do you want to reflect on that?
Thank you for your question. And as I said in my earlier intervention, we had to actually get on the ground and do public awareness and initiatives to basically bring the MSMEs up to speed with what adaptation really means. So initially we didn't have the uptake of the concessional loans that we wanted. And so it involves targeted public awareness raising with key messages that these groups will understand, and they can translate how climate risk, how other disasters will impact them. As you said, these are the people who are most affected, and so we had to take that extra care and the extra time to ensure that they are aware and they understood what disaster risk means to them and how it will affect them. So I think awareness raising and providing them with information that they can use is key.
Carlos.
Sí, quería referirme a la pregunta del señor, porque me parece muy interesante esa coincidencia. En el diagnóstico que nosotros hicimos con el sector privado nos dábamos clara cuenta de que las empresas transnacionales tenían políticas de gestión de riesgo muy consolidadas y basadas en información que en algunos casos incluso superaba la información que nosotros teníamos. Y tengo que decir que además nos dábamos cuenta de que no compartían la información. Y justamente es en el sector de pequeña empresa y media donde hay ausencia de políticas claras. De eso nos ha llevado a que desde la perspectiva de políticas financieras, políticas en materia de crédito, en materia de seguros, se den lo que nosotros llamamos condicionamientos alrededor del crédito. Concretamente en lo que es el concepto de banca para el desarrollo, se condicionan los créditos a medidas de adaptación y medidas de gestión de riesgo, con ejercicios de supervisión respecto al cumplimiento de ellas. Adicionalmente, y esto es un tema interesante, incluso con una discusión que tenemos por la siguiente situación. Cuando se habla del tema de seguros, hay una intención muchas veces de que sea el Estado el que aporte el seguro, por ejemplo, seguros paramétricos para favorecer a la pequeña empresa. Y esto en algunas ocasiones, o por ejemplo a través de mecanismos de fondo de emergencia, tener los recursos necesarios para ayudarles a la recuperación si se presenta una situación de desastre. Eso desde la perspectiva de toma de decisiones sobre el negocio puede expresar un incentivo perverso, porque pareciera muy cómodo que otro asegure o que otro tenga un fondo, y cuando yo tengo una manifestación del riesgo, o sea, que se produzca el daño, entonces alguien me cubre. Eso no es una buena práctica, porque dentro de la lógica del negocio debería considerarse un adecuado análisis del riesgo para resolver hacia dónde oriento mi producción. Entonces estamos justamente en esa disyuntiva, desde hasta dónde debe llegar el Estado en esquemas de aseguramiento o de protección de los créditos, y hasta dónde el dueño de la producción, pequeña producción, también tiene que hacerse responsable una parte alrededor de esto. Justo en este momento estamos en esa naturaleza de discusión, replanteando incluso marco normativo para poder hacerlo adecuadamente.
Gracias, Carlos. We are running out of time, so I will now have to ask our panelists for a last remark, and I will give you about 30 seconds each. Let's go furthest away first. Tita.
Well, thank you for making my life very difficult, because there is absolutely no panacea. I give a couple of examples that, have been mentioned also in the panel, and maybe to deepen some of our own that can give us a little bit of a light. First of all, FinFund, a Finnish development financer and impact investor, has disaster risk reduction comprehensively built into the investment process since the summer of 21. All projects are assessed for their risk. A disaster risk and mitigation plan is also required for projects assessed to have a high or medium high risk. And investees usually take a very constructive attitude to the mitigation measures and are willing to invest in them. So this is one of the good examples that we can all share. And then I also mentioned the Finland's public sector investment facility that works in the same way. So there are already extremely good examples that give us hope and give us light. And I know that World Bank is working towards the same goal. I conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nadine.
Okay, I spoke earlier about the importance of strengthening the policy framework. What I also need to say is that we should have a supporting regulatory framework and the capacity to enforce the regulations. And that is something that Jamaica is still having a challenge with. I'd also like to say that we should build a culture of risk management, starting with the public sector. The Bank of Jamaica has started the process of looking at stress testing financial institutions as it relates to climate resilience, and our public assessment branch, investment assessment branch, they're also using climate tools to assess proposals for investment plans and programs. So I think the public sector can lead the way where that is concerned. I also want to close with a quote from the UNDR's policy brief on financing, prevention, and de-risking investment. It says, to build a lasting resilience, the ability to cope with shock, to adapt to stress, and ultimately to transform through crisis is critical, but it cannot be done without adequate financing. And as Caribbean SIDS, our middle-income country status has significantly limited our access to concessional financing to accommodate building with resilience. So I support the call of my Caribbean colleagues for the use of a multidimensional vulnerability index to address this challenge. Thank you.
Thanks, Nadine. Carlos, un par de palabras.
Sí, lo que yo quisiera mencionar es que se pone en evidencia que el tema de la gestión de riesgo como agenda, como estrategia, no es un fin en sí mismo, sino que está íntimamente vinculado a decisiones de orden económico y decisiones de carácter financiero. Eso demanda una responsabilidad evidentemente del Estado en las instituciones y organizaciones que manejan las finanzas, pero también está en el ámbito de la toma de decisiones del sector productivo, de los sectores privados. Lo que sucede es que todo debería confluir hacia propósitos comunes, y ahí es donde la función planificadora del Estado debe ser el punto de referencia para cualquier tipo de actor que quiera abordar ese tema con seriedad, básicamente.
Muchas gracias. Last but not least, Elena.
Thanks, Niels. I would like to conclude where I started, that we will not be able to achieve the SDGs, neither the Paris Agreement, unless we step up our efforts to embed risk reduction into the government and also financial decisions. And if we are serious, we need, I will repeat myself, we will really need to upgrade the metrics. And we have a golden opportunity. As you know, at Glasgow, at COP26, there was an agreement that the member states, the constituencies, will work on a global goal for adaptation. And all of you here are experts in disaster risk resilience, and you know that some of the metrics of DRR, of Sendai framework, actually, speaking very well to this global goal on adaptation. So it's an excellent opportunity. We need to lobby about it so that indeed, we
my panelists here. Thank you to everyone in the room and those of you who have connected online. It's been a pleasure to moderate this conversation. I'll leave you with two thoughts of my own. Well, not really my own, but what I think, two things I picked up of particular importance. I think it was very important to stress the point that was made here in the room, that we do in the context of thinking investments, thinking business. We cannot forget the importance of ensuring universal access and the inclusivity in the investment decisions. And it was mentioned by Tita that probably grant financing is required to incentivize and enable that for a while. I would like to add, I think improved regulation in many countries could be another important tool to drive that agenda. And finally, I think it's relevant to restate the high risk and low returns is not conducive for involving the private sector in anything disaster risk reduction. We do need collectively through information, regulation, planning, enabling better preparation of operations and projects to change that equation, to increase the returns and to lower the risk, and otherwise involving private sector and private capital in anything climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction will remain an elusive dream. So with that, 2 words on housekeeping. We thank you for joining us today. I have to ask you to vacate the room after the session because of COVID protocol. It needs to be cleaned. I would also like to remind you and invite you to answer the Global Platform 2022 participant survey, and the feedback you're giving to the organizers is a key part of improving this type of events. But thank you very much everyone for joining us today. I hope you have a tremendous rest of your day.